Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Ophir Gutelzon. I am one of the leaders in Unacceptable and co-founder, and I'm in Palo Alto. And we are doing this series of conversation about what's going on in Israel. And today I'm very, very glad to have Dahlia Scheindlin with us. Dahlia, thank you for being with us.
It's an honor.
Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin is a political consultant specialized in a liberal and progressive cause and a journalist. And she has advised 9 national campaigns in Israel and has worked in 15 other countries. She conducted public opinion research for Israeli and international civil society group with focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, democracy, human rights, specific sectors, and a division within the Israeli society. Her book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled, was published in September, and an article that you probably read many of them are on New York Times, New York Post, The Guardian, Haaretz, Newsweek, and Washington Post, and others. Dahlia, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So it's day 173, I think, post October 7. We start this discussion usually with just giving an update, and unfortunately there is no much update on the 134 hostages that are still in Gaza. There is still no, it doesn't seem like our relationship with the US is getting better, just getting worse. And the political situation in Israel is not seems to be close to finding a date for a new election. And today we are going to go over with Dahlia about what we were mostly dealing with until October 7, the judicial overhaul and the degradation in the status of democracy in Israel. There is no one probably better than Dahlia to give us the point of view of what's going on. So we'll start with about 10 to 15 minutes about background, reminders, and where we are now. And then we'll have a conversation. And then I will take questions. I will pick up a couple of questions from the chat. And you can feel free to write to me or to David, which is co-hosting with me. Thank you, David, for being here with us. Dahlia, how are you doing? You said you're in New York, and I'm sure you are seeing what's happening in Israel. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. This is the first time I'm back since mid-November in the US. So first of all, I really just want to open by saying I have to express enormous gratitude because I think that all of the work that Unacceptable has been doing and the activism throughout 2023 was so essential and really was incredibly morale building for Israelis. I live in Israel and had been living in Israel for 27 years, and it was just an incredible boost to our efforts. And I think that you should know that it was very, very deeply watched and appreciated. Also, it was great to be able to come here and join some of the demonstrations myself, knowing that they were going on everywhere. So I think it's been a huge contribution. What I want to do is take us back to what happened over 2023, not to give you a history lesson, but to remind people that the same, underlying reasons why the government established what we now call the regime coup are still very much in force because it's still very much, the same government. And so what was interesting is when we talk about the crisis of 2023, we talked about it, initially it was a set of judicial reforms. That's how it was presented. But quickly, we all changed the language to a judicial attack or a judicial assault. And then it was a judicial overhaul, haficha mishpatit. But then very quickly, it became the term that we use now, haficha mishtarit, a regime coup. And I think that that is really important. That is how you need to think about it, because ultimately, the attacks on the judiciary were not really the end goal. Okay, they were the means for this government to achieve overarching aims that would redefine the identity of Israel, both its political identity and its national identity. And the overarching aims of the government, again, the next most important means was to have unrestrained control for the executive branch, which, by the way, in Israel, this is the country with pretty much more executive power, that is, fewer institutional checks and balances on the executive branch relative to pretty much any other democracy. If you go through a whole list of the normal checks and balances in democratic countries, Israel has almost none of them. We have some checks and balances in practice, right? Many parties being fragmented. We have regular elections, too regular. So people often don't think about that. About the fact that the executive power is essentially structurally unconstrained. But the government wanted still fewer constraints. They wanted to consolidate as much power in the executive. And what were the overall aims the government was trying to advance? I think, in no particular order, ensuring and elevating Judaism or the Jewish identity to a far higher status, essentially Jewish superiority by law, which of course entails inequality, as an integral part of the constitutional order in Israel. They wanted Israel to become essentially a theocratic society. It's already a country with very little separation between religion and state, which has been, of course, and continues to be one of the main I think challenges to establishing a democratic order, but they wanted to have it become more theocratic. And it was an annexationist government, which wanted to extend, as it so clearly wrote in the coalition agreements of late 2022, it wanted to establish full Israeli Jewish sovereignty, right? Narrowly defined as Jewish self-determination in all areas of ancient Israel, basically, and that included explicitly in the coalition agreements what they call Judea and Samaria, what we call the West Bank. If to do those things, the government needed to have ideologically aligned figures in the government, even if those figures were corrupt, then I see it as a kind of secondary goal to legitimize politicians who are either on trial or who are facing corruption charges or who have been convicted of other kinds of criminal acts, like our Minister of National Security. So in a way, alongside a government that was attempting to advance the overall aims of inequality, theocracy, annexation, it was also a matter of legitimizing corruption in government, as well as gutting some of the state and public services, which is what we saw so sadly on October 7th. I think those are the general areas by which you should measure what the government is doing now. And I think that, now I'm going to move to where we are from the start of the war through the present. So let me just remind everybody that it seemed like there was a great victory for those who are protesting to support democracy and to reject this government's aims. And that victory was on January 1st, when the High Court struck down the only actual piece of legislation that the government had been able to pass the entire year. And that was the famous reasonability clause, which, for anybody who's not inside this, who doesn't know what I'm talking about, let me know if you want me to explain it. It would require stopping to explain it a little bit. But essentially, it was a mechanism of reducing the court's ability to review government action, specifically government appointments, but any sort of executive action. The court would have less power to constrain or rule against government activity. The High Court struck down a basic law for the first time, and it was considered a big victory, even a symbolic end to the government's judicial assault. I am here to tell you that that is not the case. The judicial assault, the regime coup, is alive and well. So I'm sorry this isn't terribly optimistic. I think there are two core dangers to keep in mind, or even if I don't want to put it in alarmist terms, there are two processes that I've observed, that anybody can observe, that the government is doing, that we should keep in mind. One is structural changes they have been trying to make even since before the war, and even beyond specifically the reforms to the judiciary, and advancing bills or policies and eventually laws that are designed to constrain or erode civil liberties and protections and implement undemocratic policies since the war. So structural changes versus very specific policies they're trying to advance, even if they have essentially paused the specific package of judicial reforms that was presented in January 2023. So that's how I'll kind of categorize the things that I'm working on. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is, I think, for anybody who reads my column in Haaretz, I started working on an article just about this issue one day, it was last week, And 24 hours later, I had so many examples that I couldn't fit them into a regular article. And I had to write 2,000 words. And the examples are coming every day. And I thought, what is this? I mean, is this an accelerated frenzy of advancing undemocratic bills, like, policies, et cetera? And I realized, well, actually, I would give credit to the people I spoke to. The political scientist Dahlia, who's an excellent thinker on this stuff, said, well, she thinks that the government is racing to do everything it can, knowing that they are politically unpopular and their time may be limited. So on the one hand, I know, if you're on this call, you probably want to see this government fall and have early elections and bring about a different kind of government. But keep in mind that the government is quite aware that that's what the population in general has in mind and is probably trying to do advance as much of its agenda as possible. So now let me move to the main areas that I see the government advancing anything to do with these overarching aims, these structural and identity changes in Israeli life, or advancing the mechanism, which is consolidating control in the power, or consolidating power for the executive branch. And I'll walk through a number of these areas. Number one, I think that to my mind, the most, the kind of biggest area where the government is trying to consolidate power is through political appointments. And when I say political appointments, the range of fields where the government has been trying to shift the balance of power from professionals to military appointments is dizzying as far as I'm concerned, and it often is off the radar. I'll remind you that earlier in 2022, the government tried to insert political figures into the board of the National Library. They have brought that initiative back to try to put some political loyalists into the board of the National Library. They've tried to put more political appointments or political loyalist appointments on the Higher Education Council in Israel, which governs policy over higher education and universities. They have recently passed a law that gives more power to the ministries with relation to planning and zoning councils. Now, this is like incredible technicality. I hope you don't think I'm wasting your time, but I see precisely these things that are off the radar, where the government can get away with making these sorts of changes as particularly insidious because we're not paying attention. Okay. As you may have also noticed that last week the government was trying to, oh, by the way, the political representatives now that are going to be on the councils for planning and zoning and land use in Israel are not just any politicians, but they're representative of the ministries that are held by religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power Party. So again, presuming some knowledge about the Israeli political system, these are the most extreme ultra-nationalist forces in Israeli life. The influence of the intervention of political figures into institutions and authorities in Israeli life that are supposed to be independent has already been seen. In December, the head of the Authority for Government Corporations, which are the corporations that manage things like national resources, but they are independent. They're supposed to be professionally managed, even though they're headed by a governing authority. She resigned because there was so much political interference. And numerous professional staff at the highest managerial levels of the Ministry of National Security have resigned because of really gross political interference of the Minister of National Security. Reminder, that's Itamar Ben-Gvir. Even the Attorney General has warned him not to interfere so much. And the overall aim of all of this issue of political appointments, and again, I'm going to quote Gael Tarshil, the political scientist from Hebrew University, is to fundamentally change the balance between loyalists over professionals, right? The idea is to remove people who are in their positions, if they are at various levels of the professional level of governance or in independent authorities, managing various aspects of society, from people who are there for professional qualifications, replacing them with people who are there either because they are directly from the ministries, representatives of ministries, or because they are political loyalists. And that's a fundamental transformation of the power of the government to intervene in all these areas of life, but also will severely reduce the competence of government in Israel, which is, as we know from October 7th, was already severely eroded over time. Let me move to attempts to stifle free expression. Okay, there have been numerous examples of this. I won't have time to go through every single one, but I just want to give you a taste of, or reminder, I guess, of how the government has tried to suppress demonstrations, particularly basically banning demonstrations critical of the war effort in the earliest months in Arab communities and Arab towns. Mostly these were demonstrations calling for a ceasefire or calling for solidarity with the civilians in Gaza. They certainly, you don't have to agree with every political opinion, but the fact is that the police essentially announced a ban, broke up some of those demonstrations using force, and then told the Supreme Court that they would weigh each permit application separately, but in practice have created an environment of intimidation, not only for Arabs, but of course, Jewish citizens. In fact, there's never really any separation. When you have a police or any authority that is acting to suppress civil rights, it never stops at one minority population. It will always eventually touch all citizens. And there's been intimidation of Jewish Arab demonstrations in Tel Aviv, just calling for solidarity with each other. So that, intimidation, again, can mean denying a permit, then changing their minds, then fundamentally creating an uncertain environment. And that there have been numerous Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel who've been arrested or even just brought in for questioning for things like Facebook posts. That this has been, hundreds of people in that situation. Some of them were never charged, were released, but this is a matter of harassing and intimidating people from expressing views critical of the state. I should say that, again, you don't necessarily have to agree with all the political opinions of those citizens, but this kind of intimidation is never taking place against, Israelis openly calling to destroy Gaza, to flatten Gaza, the kinds of things that have gotten Israel into trouble with international law, and is part of the reason why Israel is now facing charges at the International Court of Justice. We have attempts to suppress freedom of press. And on this one, I want to make the point that there were policies and bills and reforms that were presented already well before the war. What we're seeing is continuity. Okay, so these are not necessarily things that are new after the war, but simply areas where the government doesn't think you would notice that they're continuing with them after the war. So prior to the war, in the summer, I think it was about August, the communications minister from Likud, Shlomo Kari, presented a whole series of reforms to the media that would basically erode the independence or the viability of the public broadcaster and boost the advantages of Channel 14, which is a very right-wing loyalist, politically loyalist media outlet that is essentially, I don't know, I think the equivalent would be something like Newsmax or One America Network. And he has essentially continued trying to advance those reforms, even though they hadn't passed yet before the war. But now he's doing it under the cover of state of emergency laws, which means that the government itself can advance legislation. And that includes draconian plans to pass a law that would allow the government to shut down foreign media outlets. Okay, so that's already a severe attack on freedom of expression. And each, again, tiny incremental development is another step in that direction. So some of the small developments that you should be keeping your eyes on is that about a month or so ago, a couple months ago, the Otzma Yehudit party, Jewish Power, was trying to add a clause to the draft of that law, the bill, saying that the Minister of National Security would have to sign off on any such decision to shut down a media outlet. Well, who's the Minister of National Security? The most ultra-nationalist, illiberal, undemocratic Jewish supremacist in the government, Itamar Ben-Gvir. In addition to that, we have most recently, I think as of yesterday, the communication minister himself is trying to adjust that bill to get rid of the need for judicial approval to shut down a foreign media outlet. So you replace an independent review, right? The judicial branch being independent, at least for the meantime, with the most extreme minister who would probably give himself a very free hand in trying to suppress foreign media outlets in Israel. So that's on the level of freedom of expression. So you have freedom of expression and freedom of the press that are under threat. Essentially, significant attempts to erode civil liberties. Let me get into the annexationist agenda with just a couple of examples. And this touches on what I mentioned before, the structural changes that the government was trying to implement before the war. One of the first things this government did was create a special position called an additional minister in the Ministry of Defense. That went to Bezalel Smotrich from the Religious Zionism Party. It's very bureaucratic and technical to explain, but it's essentially transferring the IDF's powers to a civilian minister, which is a form of extending the control of the civilian state over parts of the West Bank. Effectively, it's annexation, okay, to all intents and purposes. Now, the latest thing that Smotrich has done is to announce that he's going to declare huge, big swaths of territory in the West Bank as state land. Again, a very technical, bureaucratic, almost impenetrable mechanism that is invisible to the outsider, but essentially says that this land is only for Israel's use. We will then use it for whatever we want, whether it's building settlements or building, closed military zones. It's all a form of annexation that is not always understood by outsiders, very easily pushed under the cover, but makes it very, very hard to reverse, because Israel will use that land to then expand settlements and build permanent structures. That's, so starting from the thing that happened, the structural change that happened almost in the beginning of this government. I think that change was formalized in February of 2023, where Smotrich became that additional minister. Two days ago, or a couple of days ago, when Smotrich announced state lands, which is one of the most significant ways of extending the annexationist agenda. There are other issues. I see that I'm getting the nod that I should wrap up, which I will soon. No? Okay. One more thing I want to mention is legitimization of policies that are essentially have been considered anachronistic in democracies, in modern times in most democracies, which is, for example, legitimizing the death penalty. This is extremely controversial, but it has come up in the context of putting the Nukhba fighters on trial. Okay, these are terrorists who were captured on October 7th. The people who committed the attacks themselves and planned it and are being held in Israeli prisons, waiting for some sort of either legal process or an exchange. And the last thing I've seen recently on this is that the government is trying to charge them with the crime of undermining, of attacking Israel's sovereignty, which carries with it the death penalty. These are various forms of legitimizing a practice that is considered undemocratic in all Western democracies, with the exception of one particular country that will remain unnamed. There's also issues of the conditions in which prisoners are being held. Okay, prisoners have rights, even if they've committed criminal acts, they still have due process rights, but also, the rights of prisoners to be held in humane conditions. But beyond that, there's also, I don't know if people know, there are hundreds of people from Gaza who were in the country legally with permits, with work permits on October 7th, who were essentially disappeared. Okay, they were captured and held incognito. So much so that 4 different court petitions were submitted by human rights organizations just to get information of any sort. 4 petitions for writ of habeas corpus that were rejected. The authorities released many of them of their own accord in November, but hundreds, as far as we know, which is all a guess, are still being held completely incognito. So this is, I hope I don't need to explain why that should frighten anybody who might be subject to the same regime. This is the same regime that is governing Israel. And finally, one more last point, the government has not given up on its attack on the judiciary per se. And the example that I would give you there is paralysis in the Judicial Appointment Committee. The Judicial Appointment Committee, of course, is headed by the Justice Minister. He was not able to re-engineer the Judicial Appointment Committee to give more weight to politicians from the coalition as they had planned. That was a big part of the judicial overhaul that he wanted to promote. And as a result, he has simply first refused to convene the committee, then eventually did convene the committee, but the committee has been completely stymied over the political agreement between the different views on the committee of which justices to appoint. They have been very slow. There are severe vacancies right now in the Israeli judicial system. And most importantly, they have refused to appoint a permanent president to the Supreme Court, which is, like the Chief Justice. And there are 2 judicial Supreme Court vacancies that they won't fill because the head of the committee, the Justice Minister from Likud, as actually a lawmaker put it to me, Efrat Reiten, who's a labor lawmaker, that's a bad slip, said that they're basically holding them hostage. Why are they holding the positions hostage? That the coalition loyal figures on the Judicial Appointment Committee do not want to approve either the identity of the Supreme Court Chief Justice unless they are guaranteed that the committee will appoint the 2 justices to the Supreme Court who the government considers to be loyal to them. So all of these things together are continuing I think in maybe even in worse ways. And by the way, I didn't even get to many examples that came up when I was researching this article. But I think that all of these combined really represent a very, very severe erosion by any measure of civil liberties and the protection of human rights. And ultimately, they will affect electoral integrity as well. That's why, and I'll conclude with this, one of the major democracy indices that do comparative studies of democracy all around the world, this is called VDEM. It's one of the most authoritative such indices, has just recently downgraded Israel for the first time ever from a liberal democracy to an electoral democracy. And if you're not sure what the difference is, a liberal democracy has all the civil rights and protections that we just went through, guaranteed by the separation of powers and the independence of the courts. An electoral democracy is a place where people can point to an electoral process and say, you see, we held elections. That's all that matters. The last person who did that was Putin a few days ago. Okay, he got 87% of the vote because there are no civil liberties in Israel. To my mind, there is no such thing as an electoral democracy. It's an oxymoron. If it's only an electoral democracy, it's not a democracy. I would add that given the extent of Israel's annexationist policies that did not start in 2023, okay, this has become a permanent occupation that has essentially become annexation. We can no longer really truthfully assess democracy in Israel based only on what we used to call Israel proper or Israeli citizens. The Green Line is no longer relevant. Even VDEM needs to really, I think, ask itself, as well as Freedom House and all the other indices, if the time hasn't come to assess democracy in Israel based on everyone Israel controls. My book deals with that issue extensively, and I'll stop here and look forward to your questions.
Okay, let me just try and yeah, that's fine. So this is really alarming. I was calling this conversation fascinating. Now I think it's alarming, and it's alarming mostly because we were discussing it in different conversations that politically Netanyahu is aiming to extend the war, unfortunately, as much as he can for political survival. And what you're saying is that under the war mask, he could actually do the government and the other partners can do much more. And the question is, like, I mean, who is in charge? Who is politically, or not politically? Which organizations in the institutions of democracy in Israel are still left out there to be gatekeepers for those changes? Is it like local authorities like I mean, you're going to tell us probably better than I will. Who can still protect the democracy in Israel right now?
Well, I don't think I have any great surprises here. I mean, the number one institution is going to have to be this, the judiciary, the Supreme Court, and all the arms of the judiciary. That will not save Israeli democracy on its own. To the extent, well, Israeli democracy in Israel, whatever you want to call it, it won't. In fact, one of the more disturbing trends is that during the war, the Supreme Court has been much more likely to reject petitions, criticizing government action. And I can go through all, like I said, the four petitions for the writ of habeas corpus to find out anything about people being held incognito were rejected by the court, and numerous other challenges. The challenge to Ben-Gvir, like the petition to the court that Ben-Gvir should not be allowed to serve as the Minister of National Security due to his prior convictions, was rejected by the court. Now, I don't think, as one of the law scholars that I quoted in my article, and I consult with him all the time, Adam Shinar, has pointed out, it is not unusual for Supreme Courts to be more, less interventionist and put less constraints on the executive during wartime. But that just means that as much as we want to depend, we should not assume that it can only be the Supreme Court. It never was. The Supreme Court, of course, has legitimized much of the policies that have to do with the West Bank and occupation over the years. So I think that all figures within the judiciary are important. That's one thing to keep an eye on their independence, but also keep an eye on political appointments within the judiciary beyond just the Supreme Court. The battle over who is the Chief Justice and the appointment of justices will be very important. But of course, I think that I know you're going to ask me where I see optimism, and I'm already nervous about it. because it's very hard to make up, false hope. But I do think there is something that that really has been an extraordinary thing, and that is the mobilization of civil society. So basically, you guys and people, your counterparts in Israel. I mean, this was an extraordinary mobilization already in 2023. It has become, in a way, even more extraordinary in the weeks and months after the war, because the really, I think that this was just a miracle that the infrastructure of civilian mobilization was in place to help cope both with the displaced in Israel, help rally donations and distribute them around the country, and help support the people who've been displaced because of the Hamas's attack and the war, and also mobilize society on behalf of the hostages, freeing the hostages. But I think that ultimately, what we're doing now, I feel privileged to be part of it, because I think ultimately the civilian mobilization needs to get back to reminding the government that we are aware of every single injury to democracy that they are trying to advance, and that there needs to be a backlash every time the government thinks that people aren't watching. And I understand it. People are in survival mode still. People are traumatized in Israel. It's very hard to get bigger crowds out onto the street. But I think that the strategy of this incredible infrastructure for civilian mobilization needs to keep their eye on every single tiny technical development, and the big ones that I just went through, and all the other ones that should be included. Yeah. And think of a response to them, because those are the gatekeepers. Now, of course, free press, independent media is critical. I think trying to defeat or put up a public protest against the communications minister's bills is incredibly important. If these things aren't exposed, you can't expect social media to do the job. It's too erratic. It's too the information is untrustworthy. It's too polluted, with bots and corrupt forces. I think that we really I'm sorry to sound like reactionary, but I think mainstream media is critical here, and has been maligned, of course, in the populist era. But any injury to the independence of the media is going to be deadly right now. So there are many. I think the work is cut out for civil society. Civil society needs to be very activist about this, and I think should keep their eyes precisely getting back to the question of democracy and where it's being attacked or threatened is the most important gatekeeper. Civil society, media, independent judiciary. No magic, no new ideas. Like, I don't think there's a new thing I can come up with. But
the question is, like, as you said, I mean, like the civil society has become much stronger, but on the other hand, also very fragmented. There's a lot of groups out there. There's a lot of protests, different, and it's a question connected to probably in two ways. One is there was a very clear message before October 7th, the judicial overhaul, which was driven by maybe a question, maybe the Hungarian way that Netanyahu took, which is like make a blitz of everything together. And now we are moving to the Polish way, which is what we call the salami way. But either is like any message that could be working back in October 7th that we can use now to move more people outside, because there is a draft law, and there is those freedom of speech laws, and there is obviously the war out there. I mean, like, if there is any other any message you would recommend that would gather people together to stop what you keep calling judicial overhaul, we keep calling judicial overhaul?
Regime. I think regime coup is better. Hafecha mishtarit, I think, is better. I mean, the question of messages is always tricky. I'm a campaign professional, or at least in part of my profession, and we were taught, that we develop campaign messages through focus groups, and then we test them in surveys. And it's hard for me to just pull something out of my head. But I do think that the main message should be that the regime coup is not dead. The regime coup is back worse than ever. Now, I don't think that I'm the only one saying this. I certainly, there have been others who have been trying to make the case, but I think it's still been pretty marginal. I don't think it's very central in the discourse in Israel today. And I know that the priority for everybody is releasing the hostages. For me too, I think it's going to be, honestly, I think that's part of the obstacle. It's very hard to mobilize people for anything else, because everybody's first priority is to try to do what we can for the hostages. I have to say that I'm in a very dark frame of mind about it. There aren't nearly as many hostages who are still alive. Tragically, the government clearly is under no pressure, under no sense of urgency to have them released. And as much as we've all kind of admitted well, at least Marwan Issa seems to be definitely dead. Sorry. We're just, we're all waiting for this war to actually come, for some of the aims of the war to materialize, but they've been so slow in coming. And the main aim that has not materialized is release of the hostages. We all have allowed ourselves to admit very cynically that this government is probably trying to drag out the war in order to save itself. And I think we have to, I'm sorry to have to say this, but I think the government is also playing with the lives of the hostages, possibly precisely for this reason. As long as the mobilization of civil society is focused on the hostages, it's not paying attention to the other things that we're talking about. Honestly, the message that, this is not strategic. I'm really just riffing on my personal ideas right now. But I think that the time has come to admit that Netanyahu is lying about the hostages, right? Every time he says military pressure will bring back the hostages, America, the UN Security Council is detrimental to the hostage negotiations. No, nothing that Netanyahu government has done since the last hostage deal has brought the hostages back. Whatever he's doing has not brought them back. And it's time to admit that he knows that as well as I do, because the hostages are not with us. And, I don't want to, take away from people who are demonstrating on behalf of the hostages, but the fact is that's not been very effective either. Okay. So as much as I want there to be, great demonstrations of solidarity with the hostages, I would like for people to realize that sadly those demonstrations are not working. And yet where the demonstrations were effective was in, putting the boot on many of the actual attacks on the judiciary during 2023. So those who are able to redirect their efforts back to it need to realize that they're not getting anywhere by demonstrating on behalf of the hostages. Maybe there are other strategies. I hope there are. It torments me every day that the government is lying to us. Never, this is not to excuse Hamas. First of all, I blame Hamas. They took civilian hostages. It's an act of terror. It's, a violation of international law. It's probably a crime against humanity. So I don't want this to be misunderstood. But the Israeli government's policies are not advancing their release. And anybody who is thinking about, the dangers of this government, who is able to make that decision to break away from putting their energy to demonstrations for the hostages, to redirect their energy to showing the government that with every single policy or initiative or bill or whatever, just a government decision that undermines democracy and legitimizes undemocratic practice, we will be there on the street. I think that's probably a message I would like to get across. Did I freeze? Did Ophir freeze?
No, it's me.
You're good.
Okay.
My internet is slow. Something wrong. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You're good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Something happened to my internet, but I heard everything you said. What's really questionable, we keep saying this government, and this government also has Gantz and Eisenkot as part of the war cabinet and as part of the government. They're been there for almost 6 months now. As someone who did political campaigns, why are they still there, and what is the options for them to? If they leave the war cabinet, could it accelerate? Do you think could accelerate the return of the hostages? It could accelerate the elections being, the date for elections being defined. What are your thoughts from political perspective?
Yeah, honestly, we're about to see. Saar left the government yesterday, and I think
Saar, just for those that know, Saar was part of Benny Gantz's party, and he left Benny Gantz's party 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, under the assumption that he will join the war cabinet. And when he saw it doesn't happen, he left the coalition, right?
Yeah. He left first. He broke off from the party, taking basically 4 of the party's 12 seats, and then he said he gave an ultimatum. I think you had it just right that he wanted to join the war cabinet or he would leave the government. It didn't. The war cabinet did not expand itself to include him. Netanyahu basically didn't agree, and then he announced with a actually fairly interesting speech a couple of days ago that he was simply leaving the government. So he takes out 4 seats from their They had 64 plus 12, 76, and so now 72. So the government still has a lot of leeway, right? The government will not collapse unless others start to leave. And so I wonder, for a moment, I wondered if Sa'ar was hoping that he might act as the domino that tips the other ones to leave. But I mean, these are calculations in the minds of individual leaders. And in terms of political strategy, honestly, to be able to try to recreate what they're thinking, I'd have to know them better, and I don't. I think that during the early months of the war, it was the right decision for them to join because, frankly, the country's fundamental security was at stake, being run by a government of complete incompetence. A government that was so incompetent that it allowed October 7th to happen without detecting and preventing it, was unable to respond to it, and was run by a bunch of one politically obsessed save my skin prime minister, and the most influential ministers are messianic fundamentalists who were unable to listen to professionals. So they were not able to manage this war effort without, I think, some people who come from a professional background of military strategy. And so I think, and also for the sake of national morale and unity, I think it was the right thing. The question becomes how long. And this is certainly, to my mind, one of the main reasons that Netanyahu refuses to entertain plans or to even consider plans for the day after. He doesn't want to name an end to the war. He doesn't want to set goals that would indicate when the war is over. Okay, so Marwan Issa is now finally dead. But I don't think there's anything beyond the assumption that Israel should kill the top leadership of Hamas and maybe destroy some number of their fighters and maybe all of their battalions. And some percentage of the tunnels. But, I think that Netanyahu is very cagey about defining those goals, refuses to talk about a day after, because then you'd have to define a marker for when the day after starts. And that would certainly be the end of, the expanded coalition. But even when the coalition breaks up, whenever it does, I mean, Gantz could leave tomorrow and he would still have the original 64. And that's why 64 seat majority of his original coalition. That's why it was so important to see, well, it continues to be important to see how the drama over the bill for the conscription of ultra-Orthodox plays out. Because with the moment the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who is from Likud, right, he's from the original 64 coalition, said that he would not back the bill and he would consider, he's basically threatening to leave the government over the original bill that was proposed because it was such a, essentially formalizing the exemption of the ultra-Orthodox kind of in really extraordinary, in your face kind of terms. He said he would not back it. He would not vote with the government, which means breaking from the government. That threatened the stability of the original coalition in ways we had not yet seen. I will remind people that not one government in Israel has toppled in the past because of disagreements over the issue of the draft of the ultra-Orthodox. And so it's the kind of thing, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Everything seems like, like it seems like everything's changed since October 7th, but I wouldn't be surprised if the same old thing topples this Israeli government in the end, right? The competition over the ultra-Orthodox serving in the army, religion, state issues, more than anything else. But I think that it will ultimately come down to a decision inside the minds of Gantz and Gallant. And then and if Gallant, votes against the government or defects somehow from the coalition voting, then he will have to have more Likud people go with him because.
And just to remind everyone, I mean, the Likud used to be a very liberal Zionist party. And in many ways, I don't know if I want to compare it, but I mean, the same way as MAGA took over the Republican Party, something happened in the Likud over the years where Netanyahu brought his people. And you mentioned that you mentioned a couple of things during your word in the beginning about getting more loyalists and less professionals into the government. And we saw what happened on October 7th morning and the days after, how the government didn't actually operated, the ministers, I mean, and the civil society work. But what's happening in the academia? I mean, the academia seems to be, there is a lot of things that happening. Israel Prize was canceled and then brought back. Maybe you can talk more about that, because that's the essence. I sometimes call it Chernobylization, right? It's like when you see the system stop working, Maybe you can talk more about the education and the other professional part.
I will. I mean, I think I would say the more urgent focus is on policing. Because I
Policing.
think
Yeah.
the crisis is more urgent there. In other words, the director general of the ministry resigned months ago, long before the war. Other top managerial staff, professional staff in the ministry have resigned. The police are resigning. I just saw a promo, so I can't stand by this, but I saw a promo for I think one of the shows on Kan Hadashot, which is our independent public broadcaster, which is going to do a special just on this. And one of the promo lines is that the policemen themselves, or policemen and women, are resigning at an unprecedented rate. So what happens when you have an ineffective police force? That's good. That is a formula for advancing chaos. What will the government do in the case of chaos? They'll say we need martial law, or they'll say we need, extraordinary powers. I mean, usually Israel makes these changes incrementally. I don't want to sound like a complete alarmist, but I think these are the slow and not so slow changes that we should be keeping our eyes on most urgently. In terms of academia, I mean, I think that, the Council of Higher Education is an important thing that the government has tried to appoint, Yoav Kish, which is, as I wrote in my article, it's kind of ironic that he would be replacing, professional academics on the Higher Education Committee with people who are first and foremost loyal to him or his way of thinking, given that as a pilot, you would think he appreciates professional expertise. Just saying. And that is also creating an environment within academia that people know the political constraints. They know that, that there is a likelihood of government interference when there are, political trends that are not to the government's liking. Now, this is a very sensitive issue, and I'm not sure how much we want to open it up, but you'll notice that Hebrew University took the initiative itself to suspend Nader Aslamun Kavarkian because of the podcast episode she gave and the interview that she gave. And that was, Gael Tashir, who's a political scientist at Hebrew University as well, thought that was an example of sort of self-policing in which the environment itself, the expectation of political interference leads academic institutions to take their own action. I don't want to overstate the case with academia, though, because I think academia is very lively and independent, has a long tradition of, people taking very open political positions, sometimes maybe even too much, especially in the context of the classroom. And I would just point out that the interview that Dr. Kavarkian gave was for an independent podcast, and nothing to do with the academic framework. I listened to the whole thing, by the way. It was hard listening. I did not identify things that I should have been grounds for suspension from the university, but that's just me. It's not just me, apparently. I just think that it's worth keeping in mind that as painful as the political critique may be, we do have to draw the line separating what is legitimate political criticism, even if it sounds extreme to us, and things that cross a line to justify suspending someone from her job in an academic institution, in a public academic institution. So those trends are worrying, but I do think that's another area where you talk about gatekeeping, where there is a tradition of independence. The crisis there is certainly the government would like to do what they can to affect this political takeover, but I think it's not as immediate as what's happening in the police, for example, or the direct, bills that are actually being debated right now or being advanced through state of emergency laws that are attacking, freedom of the media and suppressing freedom of expression. I think those are still more immediate, but absolutely keep your eye on academia as well. And just, that's another area where we should see the gatekeepers mobilizing.
Do you see the degradation in democracy in Israel is also part of the reason why the U.S.-Israel relationship is also degrading in the sense of values, like the anything that is alarming, that everything that you're saying is pretty alarming, and that could be a cause for the current administration taking extra steps against settlers and just showing us more tough love?
I'll put it this way. I think that the US government has been troubled for a long time by Israel's annexationist policies, but it has, kind of thrown up its hands for actually trying to address the larger issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until October 7th. And now they're more focused on trying to, restrain Israel somewhat. And this is leading to the current crisis. However, I will say, I am very, very intimately connected to American policy circles and Jewish American communities. And I think that they are baffled that Israelis, by and large, do not see the connection between occupation, annexation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the erosion of democracy. They cannot understand how we separate it in our minds. Maybe not, I shouldn't say we, because I don't separate it, but really, I know what the protest movement looked like in Israel. I did polling on this. There's almost no understanding in Israel that these issues are connected. And so that's one point. In terms of whether the concern over democracy is a cause, no, I don't really think it's a cause, but it has separately definitely injured, it really harmed, I think, the sense of personal commitment from many leading American Jews, including conservatives. This is one of the most stunning things that I've seen over the last couple of years, is that there is real difficulty understanding Israel and like a sort of tormented, what do we do now approach among organizations like well, I don't want to name names because I don't want to reveal, people who've told me stuff in confidence, but among some of the mainstream conservative Jewish organizations, some of the mainstream conservative Jewish thinkers who, if you follow them on social media or their articles, have become increasingly alienated from Israel. I mean, these were the backbone of kind of spiritual support from America, from American Jews, and from American liberal and mainstream conservatives. Of course, you can always have the evangelicals on Israel's side. But I think all that is contribute again in America, and most outsider countries, to be honest, they do not see any separation between the erosion of democracy and the occupation and annexationist trends. So they go hand in hand, and they are combining to really create a very painful rift, I think, among communities of people who used to be sort of reflexive supporters of Israel. And that includes in policy circles as well.
We have 5 more minutes, and there is I want to take us to back to the press, and there are questions that are asking, we're keeping being asked here, and also I came back from Israel like 3 weeks ago. I mean, it seems like the press itself is very supportive of the national effort to win the war, what Netanyahu is called total victory.
Yeah.
It's also seems to be that the press is not showing what's happening in Gaza. I mean, the famine, the horrors that happens because of the war, and I mean, and thanks to Hamas, I mean, being in a position that they are okay to sacrificing. On the same time, the humanitarian effort that we are doing is not enough to send enough humanitarian support. But why is it so? Why Israelis in a way think so differently than Jewish Americans? And can it be connected to the freedom of press or to the way press acts in Israel?
Well, that's a very good point, and I do try to touch on this in the book as well, because historically, there is a great level of complicity, and I don't mean complicity in a criminal sense. I just mean that in early decades of state, in a way, much of what this government is doing is regressive. If I'm sorry if people have a romantic image of Israel as having once been democratic, but the earliest decades of Israeli independence were the least democratic decades. Okay. And one of the reasons why they were the least democratic was that certainly before the 1953 Supreme Court ruling, there was no legal grounds supporting freedom of expression in Israel. Even now, we don't have primary legislation on it, only the court ruling, touchstone court ruling of Kol Ha'am. But more than that, the media they just weren't independent. Most media were arms of political parties. And all Jewish media, certainly. I mean, I'm not talking about, El Ittihad, the media affiliated with the Palestinian Communist Party, but or the Arabic version of the Communist Party newspaper, or for example, Ha'olam Hazeh by Uri Avneri. But these were very small independent papers. The vast majority of the Zionist media outlets were affiliated with particular parties, and they were willing recruits for supporting the state building project, which in the early decades of statehood, you can debate whether it's good or not, but it did not exactly cultivate the values of a free press. And it was only over the decades that the media became increasingly independent, increasingly privatized. So now it's under corporate interests. You can argue that as well, but I think it's still better than being under political interests. And I think that in wartime, one of the first things that happen is that you have a general rally round the flag effect, and the media revert to this kind of early decades, 1950s sort of loyalty to the national cause, not loyalty to Netanyahu. Okay, this is the great interesting sort of split with the usual rally around the flag effect you see in most societies, which generates big support for the war and big support for the leadership. In Israel, we're seeing divergence, high support for the war, but very low support for the leadership. The media has been part of the rally around the flag effect. Very, very little question that mainstream media has been, contributing to that. It's not a conspiracy, it's a sort of natural outgrowth. And I think that, the mainstream media still has the potential to be much more independent minded. I have a lot of criticism, which we don't have time to go into, constructive criticism, but I still think there's lots of potential. Especially, I would really point to Kan, the public broadcasters still, even despite my critique during the war, still has a more, independent selection of topics. But the question of what Israelis are seeing during this war is a painful one. I feel like there is no real excuse. Israel has over 100% cell phone penetration rate. The vast majority of those are smartphones. Everybody has social media accounts. You don't need the mainstream media to see the horrors going on in Gaza. It's not hidden. And I think that at a certain point, Israelis have the responsibility to know, just as I think Palestinians at a certain point have the responsibility to know and not deny the atrocities of October 7th. And at this point, how much grace period can you give for people living through trauma? At least they need to know. And the questions are starting to come up now, especially, it started maybe after the ICJ, South Africa's petition accusing Israel of genocide in the courts, which made big news in Israel. It has continued with the UN Security Council resolution yesterday and the crisis with America. I think Israelis are starting, at least I hear in mainstream media, starting to debate, and even say in a self-aware manner, we in Israel don't always see on TV the kinds of things they're watching abroad. It's often portrayed as, well, the media abroad is biased, but I think that I'd like to hope that starts raising questions about why we're not seeing the same stuff that everybody else is seeing, whatever the reason. But this is really going to be,
and that's obviously opening a different type of discussion about what we call the propaganda machine or the poison machine and others. And for those of you on the West Coast, we'll have a conversation in Hebrew on Thursday night, but we will probably bring it in English as well. Dahlia, I want to really thank you. There is so many other questions in the chat, but we are on time, and I really want to thank you for this briefing. And I want to thank, on a side note, everyone who sent me support messages following the story on the Haaretz. Of course, one of the newspapers who are still doing a really great job. I would just say thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining, and keep up pushing, because again, even though there are, I'm freezing again, even though there are, did I freeze?
Keep speaking, your image is frozen, but we hear you.
Yeah. Even though there are malfunctions in the Israeli democracy, again, we can always make it more perfect, and it's important for us to keep pushing. So keep following us, join your local chapters, and we are going on this. We are taking the streets soon, taking it to the streets again soon. So keep in touch with your local chapters. Have a great day, and thank you, Dahlia. And I will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody, for your activism.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dad.
And thank you, David.